You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Glad to be here tonight. Glad that you guys are here with me tonight. And if you're not here with me tonight, at least you're listening to the playback. If you're here with me tonight, make sure to hit the like button. Give me a thumbs up. Make sure to, if you haven't already, subscribe, click the bell to be notified when I'm on, etc., etc. All right. I just want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. Make sure to like and subscribe to that channel as well. All right, KWAZ Radio. Make sure to subscribe to that channel as well. But there are other shows on KWAZ Radio that you guys should be tuned into.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
That's right. Also check out the Queen's Council podcast, also here on KWAZ Radio. You guys make sure, when you have a chance, when you have a moment, make sure to hit the Cash App. $ Bitter Meds, BITTERMEDZ or Z, if you're nasty. Make sure to hit the Cash App, $BITTERMEDZ. Make sure to hit that up. What we're trying to do right now is get the show back on podcasting apps, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, etc., etc., etc. So we're trying to get back to that status and trying to get there. So you guys hit the Cash App, and as soon as we get to the figure that we need, I'll let you guys know. This way, a lot of my viewership prior used to be, or I should say listenership prior used to be through the podcasting apps, and because I've been doing these live streams, I haven't been feeding the podcasting apps. So if you want to help me get it back on there, hit the Cash App, $ Bitter Meds. See in the chat room, we got the pro-Black perspective as per usual, saying peace, fam, peace to him as well, right? This episode is somewhat inspired by all the goings on I saw today on social media. Of course, when I'm on live, this is when I'm going to get a phone call. Not a good time, of course. So, on social media, and I guess in the conscious circles, or the Pan-Africanist circles, there was a lot of discussions about religion and imperialism. And I figured, hey, let me do a show. Let's talk about that a little bit. So this paper is called, as you can see, Religion and Other Products of Empire by Richard A. Horsley. This article examines briefly ancient and modern examples of 3 different patterns of relations between empire and religion. A, imperial elites' construction of subject peoples' religions. B, subjected peoples' revival of their own traditional ways of life and resistance to imperial rule. And C, the development of religious practices that constitute imperial power relations. These cases raise key issues for religious and biblical studies, such as the modern Western reduction of religion to individual belief, the relation of the religious and the secular, and particularly the relation of religion and power. So this paper has some length to it. I'm just going to get right into it. And you guys follow along, type any comments you want in the chat. When I have a moment, I'll read your comments live on the air. The site from which most Western academics view the world is the imperial metropolis. The fields of theological, biblical, and religious studies have grown up as cultural products of the same European powers that established empires over other peoples of the world. Reading Edward Said and others on quote-unquote Orientalism and quote-unquote culture and imperialism helps us recognize how we are caught on the discourse of established fields of inquiry and interpretation. Biblical and religious studies have been very much like the field of English literature in this regard. The imperial power relations involved in the very settings, plots, and characters of canonical texts have seemed unimportant. Indeed, political economic relations in general have been ignored, seen as irrelevant to the aesthetics, the cultural content, and the theology to be mined from our special texts. As we attempt to compare notes on the matter of religion and imperialism across different subfields, the most important task may be to problematize and complexify our understanding of religion and power. That is, to consider how religious practices are related to the imperial power relations that have determined people's lives for centuries, but have gone unnoticed and unanalyzed. By no means are all religious practices the products of empire. Yet it may be surprising how much of what we study and teach is closely connected with imperial power relations. Because most of us in religious and biblical studies are only beginning to raise questions about religion and imperialism, it seems premature to attempt any comprehensive theoretical overview. Perhaps the most this article can do is to raise some theoretical issue in connection with some representative case of 3 particular patterns of relations between imperial power and religion. A, cultural elites in the dominant society, no longer satisfied with their own traditional religion or seeking solutions to their own spiritual malaise, construct subjects people's religion for their own purposes. B, peoples subjected to foreign imperial rule mount serious resistance by renewing their own traditional way of life. And C, the development of imperial religion that expresses and even constitutes the imperial power relations. I wish to examine rather cursorily, I am afraid, 6 cases, an ancient and a modern example of each of the 3 patterns above, as a way of posing questions of how religion must be understood insofar as imperial relations in various ways determine both the relations of production and reproduction and the conditions and possibilities of cultural identity and religious expression. In selecting the cases and framing the discussion, I have attempted to engage conversations among the various subfields and specialties represented in the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature, Buddhism, Islam, world religions, history of religions, ancient Near Eastern religion, Judaism, theology, and philosophy of religion. As a specialist in biblical studies, who has been pressing for consideration of ancient texts and movements in the concrete context of ancient empires and power relations, I am delighted to discover that specialists, for example in India, China, and Southern Africa, are already engaged in critical consideration of Orientalism and Occidentalism and imperial power relations as determinative factors in the construction of various quote-unquote religions. We can surely benefit from each other's explorations. In particular, the modern Western construction of quote-unquote classical Buddhism may be suggestive for the somewhat analogous ancient Roman devotion to the Egyptian goddess Isis. Similarly, the revival of Islam in Iran and resistance to Western modernization may be suggestive for ancient Judean insistence on his own traditional way of life and adamant resistance to Hellenistic/Roman imperialism. Reversing directions, the constitution of imperial power relations by the Roman emperor cult is highly suggestive for how the ostensibly quote-unquote secular festival of Christmas has become the imperial religion of consumer capitalism. Right? Consumer capitalism. Each of these 6 cases poses certain key issues that those engaged in the study of religion must explore critically. Most significant among these surely is that because of the modern Western reduction of religion to individual belief, religious and biblical studies tend to separate religion from power. Religious and biblical studies tend to separate religion from power, obscure the interrelationship of religion and power, and even mystify the effects of power. This brings us to this quote on classical Buddhism. It took its rise among an advancing and conquering people, full of pride in their color and their race, in their achievements and their progress. It made its first conquest in a great continent occupied by peoples of various races and holding widely different views. And it soon spread out over the frontiers among the nations, some of them more barbarous still than the most uncultured Indians. This is from British scholar Thomas Rhys Davids in 1895. The quotation could be about the British conquest of North America or the British military in India, but it is about quote-unquote early Buddhism, presumably a product of the vitality of classic Indian civilization, a vitality that had long since vanquished in India and had lately manifested itself in Europe. In recent hindsight on Orientalism, however, this original or pure Buddhism can be recognized as the product of the Oriental Renaissance in Europe, with its fantasies of lost wisdom, its search for languages of Eden, and its construction of classical ages long past coupled with the denigration of contemporary quote-unquote Orientals. Sensing a missing element in European civilization, European romantics sought their own lack in the East. I like that. I like where he's going here. Sensing a missing element in European civilization, European romantics sought their own lack in the East. Indian civilization held a special fascination in 2 connections. Some Europeans identified with the Aryans, a fair-skinned race of conquerors whose exploits were now being repeated by their European descendants, and some were attracted by the Indians' special philosophy of reason and restraint, quote-unquote classical Buddhism. The original classical Buddhism is constructed by Europeans, with some input by their elite Oriental informants, had certain distinguishing characteristics. First, it was derived exclusively from texts. Europeans searched for and found manuscripts which they expected to lead them to the lost wisdom contained in classical Buddhist texts. Right? This is, this goes hand in hand with what we always talk about, that these folks are studying you. And a large part of the reason why they study you, yes, it's tactical, etc. Well, a lot of the reason why they study you is because they don't have anything of themselves much to study. Right? I see we got Thabo in the room tonight. Peace to Thabo. Right? But that's a very interesting thing. If you're lacking, you're going to try to fill it, right, with the best of what someone else has. Right? And that's what these Europeans tend to do. Once the languages of the text have been deciphered with the help of native Buddhists, however, the latter became superfluous. Second, for original Buddhism, therefore, real Buddhists in Asia were of limited, mainly instrumental importance. Classical source superseded the vernacular and manuscript. The informant. Classical source superseded the vernacular and manuscript. The informant. Okay. In actual Asian practice, of course, Buddhism consists of a symbiotic relationship between lay people and monks who recite texts, perform rituals, and maintain a certain purity, and to whom lay people can make offerings, thereby accumulating the favorable karma that will result in happy rebirth in the next life. Third, classical Buddhism consisted primarily of the philosophy that had been produced by and circulated among a small circle of monastic elites. Here was what many Western intellectuals wanted religion to be: an agnostic, rationalist, ethical individualism grounded in philosophical reflection. In Asian practice, of course, this special knowledge was for a certain minority of monks who had gone through decades of discipline as preparation. Despite its absence or even repudiation among Asian Buddhists, the teaching of no abiding self proved most attractive to Western intellectuals. Fourth, original Buddhism did not incite ritual. Now we know, of course, that Buddhist practice in Asian societies involved a great deal of ritual. The very capacity for knowledge depended on ritual preparation, which in Theravada Buddhist communities generally presuppose ordination. With its reduction to classical texts and avoidance of both practicing monks and a rich ritual life, the Western construction of Buddhism seems particularly affected by a Protestant understanding of religion, and the narrow emphasis on knowledge bespeaks a European entitlement reduction of religion to personal belief. This European constructed classical Buddhism then in turn influenced modernist Buddhism in Asia. As Obe Sekir and others have discussed, Theravada Buddhists in Sri Lanka have appropriated, with modifications, this Protestant Buddhism from the Western reaction to British rule and Christian missionary pressure. In all of these ways, it seems clear that the Buddhism has been represented in the Western imagination in a manner that reflects specifically Western concerns, interests, and agendas, right? See, that's wild, right? So these guys, found something lacking within themselves, right? Sought out to understand something from these Indians, right? And added their own twist to it, right? Added their own particular twist to it, right? And then, crazy enough, it was repackaged and turned into the modern version of this ancient belief, right? If that's not an example of imperialism, I don't know what is, right? That's a pure imperialist type move, right? Nevertheless, despite the newly dawning awareness of how Orientalism has generated this religion, the imperial production and expanding consumption of Buddhism continues apace, only now focused on the Tibetan Buddhism. This seems to be driven by much the same Western individualistic spiritual quest. Yet, as the appeal of enlightened rationalism declines among Europeans and Americans, the more recently constructed Tibetan Buddhism appeals to Westerners more for its exotic, imagistic, ritualistic aspects in contrast to the rational, ethical, and textual aspects of classical Buddhism. It is not difficult to discern a distinctively Western understanding of religion operative throughout this construction of Buddhism. Several historical forces, such as the European colonial encounter with other peoples and their religions, the development of the sciences, the triumphant rise of capitalist relations of production and the corresponding emergence of the modern secular state conspired in the peculiar modern Western separation of religion from political economic life and institutions. Right? I saw someone, maybe it was Arnold Bookman, who made a similar point earlier today on Twitter. The only legitimate space allowed to Christianity by post-Enlightenment society was individual belief. On the one hand, to keep it from interfering in the imperial, industrial, and capitalist reconstruction of the world, and on the other hand, to retain it as the remaining heart in a heartless world or spirituality to nurture sick souls. Religion in the West was reduced to individual faith and marginalized activities on the Sabbath days. Caught in the comprehensive, wider transformation of the modern landscape of power and knowledge, religion no longer served as a, quote, constituting activity in the world, end of quote. Religion became merely, quote, a mode of consciousness which is other than consciousness of reality, end of quote. Generally, alienated from the relations of production and no longer directly affecting the quality of political, economic, social life, religion became more of a privatized refuge and consolation. Given the reduction of religion to individual faith or spirituality, then, is it any wonder that many Westerners felt that something was seriously lacking in their lives and their society? Buddhism, constructed and consumed by Westerners, is deeply implicated in the imperial relations in which Western elites, longing to be more complete and whole again, look to subjected peoples for the sources of their own salvation and healing. To Buddhist wisdom and meditation, to Native American closeness to the earth and sweat lodges, to African American spirit and vitality. Professional training in and teaching of religious studies in American colleges and universities are also implicated in the Western production of a religion, such as Buddhism, that arose from modern imperial relations. The construction of Buddhism and its inclusion among the world religions were heavily influenced by theological studies, out of which the study of religions generally grew. To qualify as a great world religion, a candidate had to have a founder, an organized clergy, a canon of sacred texts, and a set of defining beliefs, although it might have other distinctive features of its own, right? With European imperial expansion during the 18th and 19th centuries, the list of religions gradually expanded from Christianity and Judaism to Islam, then Confucianism for its ethics, Hinduism for its mysticism, and finally Buddhism for its individual rationality. Jonathan Z. Smith suggests that religion is, quote, the creation of the scholar's study, with no independent existence apart from the academy, end of quote. As the investigations of Lopez and others on Buddhism demonstrate, the scholar's study has indeed played a highly significant role in the construction of a quote-unquote religion that constitutes a key component in American religious practice and academic study of religion programs. Yet, that is only part of the story. The construction of Buddhism's began not in academic study, but rather in Westerners' cultural spiritual quests. Whole academic fields of textual, cultural, religious studies such as Sanskrit, Buddhism, and Hinduism then developed as secondary products. From the outset, all such fields were deeply rooted in imperial relations, as Sayed argued 25 years ago in Orientalism. Insofar those fields and those religions have become institutionalized in universities and social practice, those who study and teach religion might heed Smith's call to be relentlessly self-conscious, critical of imperial power relations, as well as of their own social location and role. This brings us to a section of the paper called Revival of Shiite Islam and the Iranian Revolution. Hope you guys are enjoying the paper so far. Make sure to drop a like on this video. If you're here live with me, be sure to comment. If you hear something that makes your antennas go up, post it in the chat room. I'll definitely read it at a certain interval during the broadcast. So the revival of Shiite Islam and the Iranian Revolution. What can happen when peoples refuse to allow their religions to be induced to private belief and their lives to be conformed to imperial power relations is exemplified in the recent revival of Islam in Iran, right? This paper is from like the 90s. So that's what I mean by recent. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 confounded prevailing models of development modernization, as well as theories of revolution. The peasantry was not involved. See example Bernard and Khalilzad, etc. One of the principal reasons is that Western historians and social scientists simply do not know how to take religion or cultural tradition or ideology into account, particularly the interrelationship of religion and politics. If we take the discourse of Iranians seriously, another principal reason is that Western scholars fail to take into account the effects of and resistance to Western imperialism. Traditionally in Islam, the Prophet's teachings of the will of God in the Quran, like those in the Hebrew Bible, pertain to all aspects of life, whether at the level of the individual, the family, or the whole people. The Western powers' control of Iran for their own economic and security interests, and their attempt to westernize or quote-unquote modernize Iran challenge and threaten the traditional Islamic way of life in the most fundamental ways. The transformative resurgence of Shiite Islam in Iran developed as a direct reaction against U.S. imperialism, which dramatically compounded the impact of previous European imperial intervention. When the democratically elected government of Mossadegh attempted to nationalize the British-dominated oil industry, the CIA overthrew the popular Iranian leader and set Mohammad Reza Shah in power. In a series of ominous steps, the Shah proceeded to repress the developing civil society and its fledgling democratic political life with the help of the CIA-trained secret police, the SAVAK, to press Western models of secularization and capitalist development. The Shah's dictatorship, supplied with the most advanced weapon systems, became the paradigm of Washington's development program for the rest of the world. Even the Carter administration, which cautioned the Shah about violations of human rights, still voiced its support for the Shah after the massacre of unarmed demonstrators on Black Friday, which was September 8th, 1978. Popular Iranian hatred of the Shah was matched by resentment of the United States, whose policies, programs, and interests the Shah was forcing on the country. So we see that it's not just African leadership that's on the bullshit, right? We see that it's not just African leadership that's on the bullshit. It also seems clear that the combination of rapid westernization, modernization, and political repression was responsible for channeling Iranian resistance and reaction into a revival of Shiite Islam. Rapid modernization forced from above that benefited only a westernized elite threatened the economic interests and way of life of important groups in Iran, such as the Bazaris, who were traditionally rooted in and supportive of the mosques, schools, and ulama or clergy. The forced secularization that accompanied rapid modernization became increasingly offensive to Iranians, particularly those who were among the first generation to acquire university or secondary education. All right. Just want to highlight something here. The forced secularization that accompanied rapid modernization became increasingly offensive to Iranians, particularly those who were among the first generation to acquire university or secondary education. At points, the Shah attacked the clergy and the theological schools directly. the vast majority of largely conservative clergy tended to continue their support of the monarchy. But even Western educated Iranians and the emerging middle class, while critical of the tradition-bound clergy, who seemed concerned only for their own vested interests, took increasing interest in their own Shiite tradition, particularly the Quran and the Prophet's family, to whose quote-unquote martyrdom Shiism looked for its origins. The repressive practices of the Shah's regime eliminated political participation by moderate and liberal as well as leftist forces, and in effect drove resistance in the direction of the revived Islam. Other meeting places having been blocked by the regime, the mosque remained the only sites where any meetings could take place. Understandably, this led toward greater influence of the mosque and the activist minority of clergy as resistance widened. So a question I have in reading this, that I'm uncertain if I've ever read an analysis of this before in Africa, but during colonialism, in fact, even before colonialism, during the Ma'afa, right, the Arab and the European slave trades and what have you, my question is, was there a surge, as far as we know, was there a surge in participation in African spiritualities? Like, was there a conscious pushback from Africans, right, to practice their spirituality, you know, their spiritual system, their indigenous spiritual system? Was there a pushback, right, than like what we're reading about now with Iran? The pro-black perspective makes the point, this seems less about black people. I think it gets there, but also I didn't necessarily want it to be just about black folks. I want it to be a kind of about humans, in the sense of, if all humans or most humans are pushing back against this religious Trojan horse for imperialism, is there instances where we were pushing back, right? And if there's instances and you guys are aware of them, drop them in the chat room. We'll talk about it, right? KW Don 7 is here. He says the U.S. dealing with Iran proves that the West doesn't give a damn about democracy. It's about their own economic interests. And the interesting thing that the paper is kind of that the paper is pointing to is how they use this religion, right, to go about their own economic interests, right? How they've kind of adulterated religion, right? And kind of made it about, well, that's your personal business, but here's this religion, you follow it, and, you know, meanwhile, we'll do what we do, which is be about our own economic interests, right? So I think the paper gets to, you know, talking about Africans in particular, but I still wanted to read this paper because I'm curious. I'm always curious to see how most humans face an issue, right? I'm always curious to see how most humans face an issue, right? And like even in this section here, it's curious to see how these Arabs push back against what was going on, right? And as someone said on Twitter earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, you can't go in these Arab countries and push IFA, right? You cannot go in these folks' country and push IF, right? To continue, the leadership of resurgent Shiite Islam was applied not only by teachers and activists, clergy such as Ayatollah Khomeini, but by Western educated intellectuals as well, such as Dr. Ali Shariati, a Sorbonne trained philosopher, sociologist, etc., Although the clergy in Shiite Iran were traditionally more independent and therefore politically stronger than those in Sunni areas, most remained supportive of the monarchy, speaking out only when directly attacked. Khomeini was the first prominent figure among the clergy to denounce the Shah, most dramatically during the wave of repression in 1963. From that point, he became the symbolic head as well as the principal voice of resurgent Islam among Iranians, opposed to Shah and Western indoctrination. After he was exiled by the regime, he regularly communicated with opposition circles in Iran and guided the revolutionary movement from Iraq and later Paris. During the late 1960s, Shariati offered lectures eagerly heard by Western-educated young peoples and others, lectures that articulated a modernized Islam while criticizing the tradition-bound clergy. Shariati's death, presumably at the hands of Savak, made him a martyr for many and contributed heavily to his influence in the revival of Shiite Islam. So, of course, we're going to get like this whole story about them. So let's see where it goes. For both Khomeini and Shariati, the revival of Islam was a direct response to the Shah's modernization programs under blatant imperial sponsorship. The fundamental problem for both the Sorbonne-educated philosopher and the great Ayatollah was the separation of religion from politics, an interesting indication of the extent of which even the terms of resistance were dictated by the Western Empire. They insisted that to split religion apart from politics, however, is a portrayal of Tawhid, or unification, a fundamental principle of Islam. The spiritual is not in a realm apart from social political life. I think we would agree with that too. That the spiritual is not in a realm separate from, social political life. Thus, every polity must have transcendent dimensions. A return to Tawhid, said Shariati, would heal the alienation of the West intoxicated, educated Iranians. Both Shariati and Khomeini also placed great emphasis on Iranians becoming reconnected with their tradition and becoming part of the Ummah, the whole people, the whole of believing humanity, which transcends both state and nation. They further stressed that Islam had to be expressed in political action, particularly against God's enemies, and both placed great emphasis on justice, which Shiite tradition had elevated to a fundamental theological, ethical principle. Quote, Islam is the religion of militant people who are committed to faith and justice. It is the religion of those who desire freedom and independence. It is the school of those who struggle against imperialism. It's interesting to hear these folks like Khomeini say that when their religion is so steeped in a history of slavery and oppression. While prominent thinkers such as Khomeini and Shariati articulated an Islamic ideology that inspired the revolution, central symbols and rituals of Shiite tradition became instrumental in the mobilization of the non-violent revolutionary movement that succeeded in overthrowing the Shah in a series of events that surprised the whole world. Two of the most obvious are the veil and mourning ceremonies. Many women active in protests, including highly educated women, proudly donned the veil again in symbolic protest against the invasion of Western culture as dehumanizing and exploitative of women, never anticipating how the conservative clergy would impose it later. Ritual mourning processions that were traditionally held 40 days after a person's death repeatedly became occasions for demonstrations against the Shah. As the security forces killed increasing numbers of people participating in these processions, they generated more and more processions that provided further occasions for demonstrations. Moreover, insofar as these processions were traditional Islamic rituals, the revolutionary demonstrations assumed a fundamentally Islamic form, with the people's frustrations and resentments channeled into traditional symbolism and resonating with symbols and rituals deeply rooted in Iranian Shiite culture. Right? So it's clear that this whole thing is just describing, right? I see Life with Nelly is here. saying good evening to Life with Nelly. You guys check out Life with Nelly's channel as well. I want to thank all of you who are here as concurrent viewers while I'm reading this paper. Make sure to hit the like button. Let's get the likes equaling the number of views. I'd appreciate it. But it's interesting to see how in protests, right, these folks clung to their indigenous, I guess, spirituality or religious system. I know it can be shown that a lot of Africans who were enslaved, who were kidnapped from their homeland, in the New World, a lot of Africans still carried a lot of their belief systems, right? But what we're seeing here is people straight up on the land, right, fighting back against this imperialism that's coming by way of like religion, right? And the question I asked in the chat, no one answered, but that's fine. The question I asked in the chat was, do we have examples of that on the continent, right? Do we have examples of this on the continent? Most poignantly, the revolutionary fervor climaxed in the late 1978 during Muharram, a month of mourning and ceremonies commemorating the martyrdom of Hussein, the third Shiite Imam, invoking a popular version of martyrdom toward a, quote, a victory of the blood of the faithful over the sword of the Shah. In the process, the significance and political effect of the traditional ritual were dramatically transformed from a self-flagellating appeal to Hussein to intercede in individuals' distress to an imitation of Hussein as the model martyr of resistance to tyranny and godlessness. In the struggle against the Shah as a tool of American imperialism, a ritual that had been instrumental to the passive acquiescence of the population to the dominant political order was transformed into a ritual of personally empowering active resistance to imperial power and collective action aimed at establishing a more just and humane social order, right? So that's what I'm really asking. Where do we have those examples, right? Do we have those examples in our own historical record? I see the pro-Black perspective makes a point that I think he made during his debate a couple weeks back that you guys should have checked out. He says, I think they always resisted, but they usually converted children who don't necessarily resist anything. You know, even on this show, we've read stories of the children of enslaved Africans or the children of the occupied Africans on the continent who went to these Christian missionary schools and or sometimes they were orphaned or what have you, and then going to these Christian missionary schools that, you know, just did them dirty, right? And so I agree with that, but I also question, right, unless the parents were slain or stolen, you know, why were these children in a position to be converted, right? That's my big question. Why were they in a position to be converted? Let's see if we could get through this, and let's get to the parts that resonate with us a little bit better. Like classical Buddhism, the revival of Islam in Iran is the product of modern imperial relations, although in an almost diametrically opposed way. Classical Buddhism was constructed by Western elites in conformity with the modern Western reduction of religion to personal belief and partly to supply the loss created by that historically distinctive reduction. Shiite Islam was revived and transformed by Iranians in direct reactions not only against Western separation of religion from political economic life, but more comprehensively against the transformation of their traditional way of life by Western political economic power. Finally, mainly during the last century of British rule in India, as colonial rule eliminated political participation by Indians, the latter invented their own Hindu traditions, and the institutions of the newly created religion known as Hinduism, in close interaction with chiefly British Orientalism and Western cultural forces such as the Christian missionary enterprise. Largely in 3 decades following the American overthrow of Mossadegh, Western educated and middle-class Iranians, along with a few progressive clergy, generated a revival of Shiite Islam, partly against their own conservative clergy, but primarily in direct reaction to the forcible imposition of Western cultural and economic forms and forcible denial of political participation to Iranians, against the U.S.-sponsored program to deny subject peoples their own cultural heritage, as well as political participation in shaping their own social and economic life. Iranian opposition took the form of a revival of the only sphere of life that remained available: Shiite cultural tradition and the ritual space and symbols of the mosque. Again, this doesn't have much to do with us as Africans, right? As far as this whole Shiite and mosque and all this old shit, but it's interesting to see how the resistance, it's interesting to see how they resisted, right? To continue. And this channeling was also partly an imposition of the imperially backed denial of political participation. The essentialist categories of Western Orientalism and the academic study of religion, including the hostile concept of fundamentalism, seem incapable of illuminating developments such as the recent revival of Islam in Iran, given the complexity of the imperial cultural and political economic forces involved. So this brings us to a part of the paper called Devotion to Isis, the Queen of Heaven. After reading Said's critique of Orientalism, it is interesting to reread classics in the field of Christian origins, such as Hans Jonas's The Gnostic Religion. Ancient relations between East and West apparently prefigured the modern relations as projected by European Orientalists. In its political apathy and cultural stagnation, the East, prior to its conquest by Alexander the Great, had sunk into a, quote, state of passivity, docility, and readiness for assimilation. Nevertheless, Eastern cultural content was salvageable with the help of the West. Greece had invented the Logos and made it available to the East, whose self-expression could now benefit from it. Salvageable cultural contents could thus be disengaged from their native soil, abstracted into the transmissible form of teachings. Babylonian religion, for example, was released from its political function, forced to stand henceforth on its spiritual content alone. Political uprooting thus led to a liberation of spiritual substance. The first cosmopolitan civilization known to history was made possible by catastrophes overtaking the original units of regional culture. This modern scholarly projection of vintage Orientalism onto ancient imperial relations raises the possibility that, like the modern Western imperial elite, their ancient counterparts among the Greeks and Romans may already have constructed religions, quote unquote, to supply their own lack from bits of cultural content that had been liberated from subjected Eastern peoples. Like Buddhism, constructed by modern Western elites, devotion to the transcendent goddess Isis, the Queen of Heaven, and initiation into her mysteries in Roman imperial society were the product of centuries of imperial relations between Greco-Roman elites and the exotic East. The cult of Isis and other Egyptian religious cultures spread rapidly into Greek cities under the empires that succeeded Alexander the Great's conquest of the East. Having gradually gained adherents in aristocratic circles in Rome, devotion to Isis enjoyed official imperial favor from the time of Caligula on. The devotion to Isis that emerges in Greek and Latin literature and archaeological evidence under the Roman Empire differs dramatically both from the uses of Isis in traditional Egyptian civilization and from previous Greco-Roman religion. Behind Plutarch's quote-unquote Western textualization of Isis and Osiris, siblings and consorts, can be seen divine chthonic forces of fertility and productivity, related in some way to the land and the Nile River. Isis was primarily an active mother who generated and nurtured life, both Horus, a symbol of the sun, and monarchic order or pharaoh, and the productivity of Egyptian agrarian civilization generally. Greeks and Romans transformed Isis into a universal force, the quote-unquote the queen of heaven, that transcended a world that was increasingly felt as confining. Quote, my single Godhead is adored by the whole world in different rites and with many diverse names, end of quote. Most important, she was the mother, lover, savior, who rescued individual souls from the fickle figure of fate. The divine force that had become increasingly powerful under the Roman imperial order, judging from her ubiquitous statues and shrines. Right? It's funny to read. It's funny to read how, you know, how different people can take up your spiritual system and elevate and demote persons and deities as they choose, or you know, as it suits them, right? In the chat room, I see there's some activity. Onitase says, in Of Water and Spirit, they kidnapped the protagonist. Like, in that story, the European hung out in the village and showed off his bike with the boy's father. When his god was dropped, the European fled with the kid, never to be seen again. Yeah, so I get that too. Yeah, that I get, right? They kidnapped kids. But again, my question becomes, how much kids were being kidnapped to kind of change, you know, the spiritual phenotype, I guess you could call it. Like how many kids had to be grabbed to really change, right, the religious or spiritual phenotype of a country or a region on the continent? Right? I mean, you would have had to be taking like every child in my mind. But you guys may have a better answer than me. The devotion to Isis differed dramatically from traditional Greco-Roman religion can be seen in the architecture and spatial arrangement of her sanctuaries relative to the rest of the urban landscape. Temples in Greece and Rome were part and parcel of the public life of the city. Statues of the gods and all kinds of sculptures, paintings, and offerings accessible from the agora or forum. A sanctuary of Isis, on the other hand, was an exotically different world apart, secluded from public urban life. In the midst of a courtyard closed off by a perimeter wall with no access from the street except a narrow gate, the courtyard also enclosed quarters for those on quote-unquote retreat from the world or preparing for initiation, as well as for the priests. Greek and Roman devotees of Isis were clearly fascinated with the oriental exotica of Isis, the Egyptian goddess. For example, Isis frequently wore between her breasts the distinctive folds of the Isaac knot, which reproduced the hieroglyphic sign for life and Ankh. Okay. Sanctuaries were elaborately decorated with reliefs, statues, and lavish painted representations of sacred animals and zoomorphic gods, a strange exotic culture in which the Roman devotee became immersed upon entering her sanctuary. As Apuleius indicates in his romance Metamorphosis, only a fraction of those who participated in the springtime public festival procession of the Navagium Isidius were actually devotees of the goddess. The considerable expense that Lucius or Apuleius incurred for his own initiation indicates that only members of the wealthy leisure class could afford the transcendent salvation proffered by the goddess, and belies his earlier claim that initiatives were of every rank. It seems clear that intellectuals were prominent among devotees of Isis, and although the majority of initiates were elite men, Isis was clearly attractive to high-status women as well, whereas the traditional Greek and Roman religion reinforced the patriarchal imperial order. Devotion to Isis, particularly the asceticism she demanded, legitimated a greater personal autonomy for aristocratic women, as indicated in the appreciative comments as well as complaints about being deprived of sexual relations by male poets such as Tibullus and Propertius. Right? You know, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about something Dr. John Henry Clarke used to talk about, where you know, he would say something along the lines of Christianity was something African, which I disagree with, but that you know, unless you're counting that region as Africa, which then would be okay, but he would say that what they did was they repackaged Judaism and Christianity and all that type of stuff and sold it back to Africans. And so when I read this, it makes me think of that. Does anyone remember Dr. John Henry Clarke talking about that? And does this passage, does this reading so far make you think about that? The pro-black perspective says it's complicated, but eventually they start missionary schools or churches that teach white ways for food or jobs, right? These schools may be taught by white folk or those formerly student children. Right, so basically what you're saying is it starts small, and eventually they get enough people, if not the kidnapped children themselves, they get others, missionaries and whatnot, coming and teaching the bullshit, right? I get that. Seems like it will take a while for that to occur, right? It seems like it'll take a while for that to occur, but at the same time, the adults, what are the adults doing during this? While this is happening, what are adults doing? Right? As we see from these other folks, they got busy and got serious about their indigenous religions. But what were the adults doing? And I know the pro-black perspective said it's complicated. I get that, right? But I always want to know what all the players, what were all the players doing when this was going down? Because I figure if we understand what everyone was doing, right? If we understand what was going down, there's a way we can actually go back and prevent this from happening again. We want to find solutions to our problems. This is how we have to do. We have to go back and figure out, well, what did we do wrong, where, and when? What should have we done instead? We can distinguish three interrelated aspects of Isis worship among Greeks and Romans, who became specially attached to the goddess. Isis sanctuaries were apparently open from just before dawn until early afternoon for adoration of a statue or image. Pre-initiates and other devotees, as well as initiates and priests, were allowed to enjoy the ineffable pleasure of adoring the image of the goddess day after day in gentle calm and exemplary silence. After receiving instruction by a priest from sacred books written in hieroglyphics in undecipherable forms of all kinds of animals and being bathed according to Egyptian ritual, those who could afford a considerable expense would undergo initiation. In a combination of death and rebirth and sacred marriage, the initiate descended into the abode of the dead and then returned, having approached close to the gods above and the gods below, and worshiped them face to face. You know, I never understood that gods above, gods below thing. Right? Gods below. The next morning, adorned in robes lavishly adorned with otherworldly figures such as Indian dragons, griffins, and winged animals, the initiate was erected on a dais with flaming torch in hand and a crown of gleaming palm leaves. That is, a divine statue of the sun, i.e., a partner to Isis as the moon. In a sudden epiphany to the company of previous initiates, finally, initiates and others' devotion to Isis was deeply emotional and entailed commitment and rigorous discipline. Long after his initiation, Lucius kept the image of Isis's countenance stored in his inmost heart. After 2 further initiations, moreover, he proudly shaved his head, in which condition he went about his duties as a successful lawyer in Rome. Many initiates maintain a strict asceticism, and some are portrayed in various forms of penitence, such as walking on their knees over the course, paving stones around the Isium, Campenzi, or traveling to Egypt, or traveling to Egypt to bring back water from the Nile. That's interesting. Scholars of Hellenistic religions such as Arthur Darby Nock have suggested that devotion to Isis was the high watermark of ancient Greco-Roman piety. Once we note the circumstances of the imperial situation in which Isis devotion developed, we may now surmise as well that intense adoration of a divine figure, not typical of Greek and Roman religion, may well have been developed in just such cults as that focused on Isis, the Queen of Heaven. It may well be that only in an intense personal relationship with this divine mother, lover, savior figure, who came from beyond the already familiar Greek and Roman civil religion, which was renewed precisely to reinforce the Roman imperial order, was it possible to find an individual, personal, spiritual security that could provide a sense of transcendence of the imperial order that seemed to leave the now isolated individual person to forces of fate. We may also detect in Roman devotion to Isis certain elements reminiscent of contemporary New Age spirituality, which appropriates indigenous peoples' religions to satisfy the personal and spiritual hunger of the Western leisure class. There seems to be some significant similarities between retreats and workshops available for a price in Aspen or Esalen and devotion to Isis pursued in the Roman resort town of Pompeii. The etherealization and commodification of the strange and exotic oriental figure of Isis and her coterie of other Egyptian gods enabled elite Greeks and Romans to find personal spiritual security and transcendence. This brings us to a section called the Religious Political Resistance and Renewal in Judea. Let's just read it. Ancient Judaism is another form of cultural content that Jonas reviews as having been liberated. European Christian theologians constructed Judaism as a unitary but overly parochial and political religion that was succeeded historically by the more spiritual and universalistic religion Christianity. The resulting essentialist discourse of Judaism persists among religious historians, just as the discourse of an essentialist Islam persists amongst Orientalists. Separation of religion from politics in Palestinian Jewish society, however, did not develop until late antiquity as a long-range result of the Romans' use of political and military power to ensure that indigenous peoples' commitment to their traditional ways of life not interfere with their submission to the imperial order. Until the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the situation in ancient Judea under Roman imperial rule was somewhat analogous to Iran under modern imperial domination. Far from attesting to unitary religion, Judaism, our limited sources for late Second Temple Judea indicate a range of unstable social forces and movements resisting the attempts first of the Hasmonean high priesthood and later of the Romans and their client Herodian and high priestly rulers to maintain order and consolidate power. The key is to recognize the general structure of the imperial situation in ancient Judea. The Persian imperial regime set up a temple state that continued as an instrumental part of the imperial order under successive Hellenistic and Roman empires. During its brief independence, the Hasmonean regime aggressively extended its own rule over Idumea to the south and Samaria and Galilee to the north in a mimesis of imperial politics. When the Romans finally took control of the eastern Mediterranean, they instilled the military strongman Herod over most of Palestine. Just as the Shah was America's favorite client dictator, so Herod the Great became Emperor Augustus's favorite client king, partly because of his massive development projects, building temples and whole cities in honor of the emperor. The high priestly families that Herod elevated to power and privilege became the ruling aristocracy in Jerusalem under the authority of the Roman governors during the first century, building ever more elaborate mansions in the upper city of Jerusalem. Both Josephus and rabbinic traditions give vivid pictures of just how predatory the priestly and Herodian aristocracy became in its collaboration with the Roman governors and their repressive measures. Like I said, every time I do a show, there has to be an ambulance. Early Israelite traditions of the people's independence under the direct rule of God became the basis for persistent resistance and rebellion against imperial rule in the late Second Temple times. This can be seen most dramatically in the Passover festival, celebrating the people's liberation from oppressive foreign rule in Egypt. The juxtaposition of imperial repression and the Judean passion to regain independence evoked by Passover vividly illustrates the utter inseparability of politics and religion from Judeans under Roman imperial rule. When the festival called Passover was at hand, a large multitude from all quarters assembled for it. The Roman governor, Camanus, fearing that their presence might afford occasion for an uprising, ordered a company of soldiers to take up arms and stand guard in the porticos of the temple so as to quell any uprising that might occur. This has in fact been the usual practice of previous procurators of Judea at the festival. When the celebrants protested a Roman soldier's lewd gesture, the governor unleashed his troops in a violent reprisal typical of Roman rule. Although scribal circles and ordinary priests charged with maintenance of the sacred traditions and traditional way of life were dependent politically and economically on the priestly aristocracy, some of them mounted significant resistance to imperial rule, just as some of the Muslim clergy from a more independent basis opposed the Shah and the West in Iran. Three of the four groups, usually treated as sects of Judaism, originated in resistance to imperial rule or played a significant role in such resistance. The wilderness community at Qumran, that left the Dead Sea Scrolls, now standardly identified with the Essenes, are thought to have originated in protest against the Hasmonean reversion to imperial rule. They abandoned their previous priestly scribal positions to launch a new exodus and renewed covenant community in the wilderness of Judea. Under Roman rule, they became more adamantly anti-imperial, viewing the Romans, the Kiddim, as the embodiment of satanic forces and rehearsing ritual warfare in anticipation of the eschatological battle between the Kiddim and the demonic forces of darkness on one side and themselves and the divine forces of light on the other. Right? This is known as the war rule. The early Pharisees, in their political religious role as interpreters of the laws of Moses, opposed the Hasmoneans' expansionist practices and their assimilation of Hellenistic imperial political culture, and hundreds of them were apparently crucified by the expansionist quote-unquote king Alexander Janai. While most of the Pharisees eventually settled into a patient mediating role in the imperial order, some Pharisees and other teachers periodically led resistance to imperial rule. When the Romans imposed direct rule in Judea, a movement called the Fourth Philosophy formed under the leadership of a teacher named Judas and a Pharisee named Zadok. They agreed in all aspects with the views of the Pharisees, except that they had a passion for freedom that is almost unconquerable, since they are convinced that God alone is their leader and master. They insisted that Judeans could not possibly render tribute to Caesar because that was tantamount to serving the Roman emperor. We may presume similar motives among the Judean teachers later in the 1st century CE, who formed the terrorist group Dagger Men. Okay, they surreptitiously assassinated collaborative high priestly figures at festival time in Jerusalem. Later accepted to place themselves at the head of the nascent revolt in the summer of 66 CE, and finally committed mass suicide on Masada rather than submit to continued Roman rule. As with the Iranian Muslims, it was simply impossible for these ancient Judean scribes and Pharisees to separate political, economic life from their commitment to God as the sovereign. And as with modern Iranians, it was the Western imperial threat to their traditional way of life that evoked such uncompromising resistance and rebellion. Now, I get that these Europeans had the Maxim gun, right? And so it made it difficult to push back against, right? But again, and I don't like comparing our people with other people and what other people have done, but there is a question that as you read this, you have to question something. These folks had these religions, which a lot of black folks now have for a particular reason. You guys know the reason, right? And it was their faith in their religion that made them fight back. Right now, again, they were fighting back in the time when fellows were wielding swords and all kind of shit like that, right? 66 CE and all this shit, right? Whereas Africans, we fell in a time where these bastards had access to gunpowder from those other bastards, right? So I get that there's that difference, and this is why I don't like to compare so much, right? But there's something that's still missing from us. we assimilated ourselves, or we've been pulled into these Europeans' religions, right? Which is how they exercise their imperialism, by the way. But we're not even using the religion that they in the past have used to rise up against imperialism. We're not even using it in that way. And my question is, okay, fine, you're not practicing African spiritual system, you're practicing whatever these Europeans, but how come you're not getting the spirit of resistance, right, in that belief that these folks were getting? Do you guys understand the question I'm asking here? I see KW Don 7 has a comment. He says, Abrahamic faiths are bastardized religions that have incorporated some African concepts within them, i.e., they all conclude their prayers with the word Amen, from Amen Ra, right? They also venerate the saints. That's ancestor worship, right? The veneration of the saints that you hear the Catholics and the Anglicans talk about is ancestor worship, but they make it seem like we're crazy for having faith in our ancestors, right? So you're right. There are items that they've taken from African spiritualities and incorporated into their own, which is what I kind of take what Dr. John Henry Clarke was saying, but he was still pushing this idea that Christianity is yours as an African, and I disagree with that, right? Different from the case in Iran and more in accordance with standard theories, however, it was the peasantry that periodically mounted serious resistance and revolt against Western imperialism. At the end of Herod's highly repressive reign, popular revolts erupted in every major district of his realm. Popular resistance persisted, and renewal movements sprouted periodically during the 70 years after Herod's death, until finally erupting more widely in the Great Revolt of 66 to 70. That most of these revolts took the social forms of popular messianic and prophetic movements indicates that they were revivals of Israelite tradition still cultivated in the village communities of Judea. When the Great Revolt erupted in 66, even the people and priests of Jerusalem took action. The priests officiating in the temple declared that they would no longer perform sacrifices on behalf of Rome and Caesar, a blatant declaration of independence. And Jerusalemites attacked high priestly mansions as well as the Roman garrison. The motivating force of all these scribal groups, popular renewal movements and rebellions, and priestly protests in their religious, political, economic commitment is that God must rule societal life as a whole, which excludes foreign imperial rule. I hope you guys are understanding my questions here in relation to what these other groups were doing. Again, I don't like, trust me when I tell you, I don't like to compare our group because our situation was distinct, right? So believe me, I'm not taking any glee in comparing, but the question still should be asked, right? Where was a foreign force is coming through, right? Like only time I said this foreign force might be kidnapping your children and putting them in these schools and stuff like that and brainwashing them. But as the adults, the men who were around, the caretakers, right? Like, really, what were you doing during this time, right? Even in Haiti, they said you have to get rid of that white God bullshit and get back to your African spirituality. I just feel like, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough, I just feel like I haven't heard this type of phenomenon often occurring in the continent. That's the overall point I'm trying to make. In this historical struggle between various Judean movements and the Seleucid and Roman imperial order, including the Jerusalem temple state and Herodian kinship, it is difficult to discern anything that fits the synthetic essentialist European construct, quote-unquote, Judaism. It seems impossible to deal with any of these movements, whether the Pharisees, presumably the ancestors of later rabbinic Judaism, or the popular prophetic movement led by Yeshua ben Yosef, right? That's supposed to be their Jesus Christ, that developed toward Christianity, except as they emerged in response to ancient Western imperial threats to the traditional Israelite way of life. By contrast with the ISIS mysteries, moreover, insofar as diaspora as well as Palestinian Jewish communities subject to Roman imperial order continue to conduct their own affairs semi-independently according to Israelite tradition, far more than religion in the modern Western sense was involved. Brings us to a section called the Roman Emperor Cult, right? The Roman Emperor Cult. The modern reduction of religion to personal faith and its separation from politics as the quote-unquote real exercise of power have apparently been obscuring one of the key ways in which power relations were constituted in Roman antiquity. Like other imperial powers, Rome clearly established its empire by military conquest and the terrorization of subjected peoples by enslavement and crucifixion. And the Romans maintained their military forces on the frontiers, partly to keep uncivilized peoples such as the Judeans under control. Okay? In civilized areas, however, Greek cities such as Corinth and Ephesus, the Pax Romana required no military force. The Familia Caesaris, the quote-unquote household of the emperor, with its staff of managerial slaves, moreover, sufficed to handle minimal administrative affairs. So in the absence of a credible military threat and a large bureaucracy, what held the Roman Empire together? Until recently, Western scholars could not even entertain the possibility that it must have been the emperor cult. It simply, quote, fell between the cracks, end of quote, of the assumed division between politics and religion. It was neither fish nor fowl. Classical scholars, largely secular in their orientation, dismiss honors of the emperor as merely superficial religious expressions. Scholars of religion, believing it impossible that ancient people could have had personal faith in the distant figure of Caesar, dismiss honors to the emperor as empty political rituals, such as pinching incense to his genius. But what if our concept of religion included cultural heritage, social forms, important communal practices, and the national, social, and even spatial environment that will be understood as integral aspects of religion in other societies? And what if we abandon a highly questionable methodological voluntarism with its assumption that people have a choice about the institutionalized festivals of their villages, cities, and peoples? People are born and socialized into those festivals. If those who exercise effective control adapt and transform them, individually persons are simply swept along with the cultural stream. Let me read that last sentence again. If those who exercise effective control and adapt and transform them, individual persons are simply swept along in the cultural stream. Although Foucault's revision of power as power relations may not be as applicable to the ancient Roman Empire as it is to the modern capitalist industrial society, with its pervasively effective discipline, it may enable us to discern previously unnoticed realities. As classical scholars Simon Price and Paul Zinker have recently explained, what held the Roman Empire together, what constituted power in the empire, was the emperor cult, operative mainly through image and ritual. In the Battle of Actium, Octavian, also known as Augustus, the hero of Western rationality, won a decisive victory over Anthony, who had come to symbolize Eastern irrationality, thus establishing the imperial order of peace and security after the chaos of the empire. After the chaos of the empire-wide Roman Civil War. The magnates of the Greek sites immediately began adding elaborate new components to traditional Greek civil religious institutions and practices. Cities and provincial councils competed for who could render the greater honors to Caesar. Most sobering for reductionist modern Western theories of religion, the presence of the emperor was thus prominently and permanently constructed into the spatial, visual, ambient, urban environment, with major architectural changes in city centers to accommodate new imperial temples and shrines, along with the erection of imperial statues in existing temples to the traditional gods. The presence of the emperor came to pervade public space. Beginning in the Greek cities, elaborate constructions and festivals in honor of Caesar as Lord and Savior of the world spread to every important town and city of the empire. Remarkable is the attribution to the very structure of societal life itself to Caesar as the divine source of life and savior of society in the images and symbols of his gospel inscribed on public monuments. You know, this is why, like in America, you see all this pushback against knocking down these statues of losers. Right? It's that same way. The most divine, or Lord, we should consider equal to the beginning of all things. For when everything was falling into disorder, he restored order and gave to the whole world a new aura. All the cities unanimously adopt the birthday of the divine Caesar as a new beginning of the year. Wow. Whereas the providence has brought our lives to the climax of perfection in giving us Emperor Augustus, whom providence filled with virtue, power, for the welfare of humankind, and who, being sent to us and our descendants as our savior, has put an end to war and has set all things in order. And whereas having become God manifest, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times. And whereas the birthday of the god Augustus has been for the whole world the beginning of the gospel concerning him, therefore let a new era begin from his birth. I mean, these guys, damn. Right? These guys, just damn. In the chat room, Pro-Black Perspective is giving us more insight. He says, there was resistance, but like you said, the technology difference by the time Europeans reached Africa was way too big. That's kind of what my mindset was telling me. I'm glad to see you agree. Pro-Black Perspective goes on to say they wiped out a whole army of tens of thousands of people with 500 guns. Yeah. It's the same way gangbangers can run the hood if all you got are knives, right? If all you got are knives. And that's something to think about when you think about New York. Places like New York and their gun laws, right? Who's in control there, right? Only the people with guns, right? So yeah, so that, you know, that's a way to look at it. That, you know, that's a way to put it all together. That, you know, by the time they got to Africa, man, they had the Maxim gun, and so getting people to bow is kind of pretty easy at that point. You know, that's the shame of it. But that also tells us what we have to do. We have to become more technologically elite. We have to be able to protect ourselves, right? To prevent something like that happening again. And we're not going to be able to protect ourselves the way we would like to here in the States, to be honest, right? Not the way we would like to. right? Because you have a gun, they have a gun. Okay, cool. The best man wins. But if you start to be the best man, they then could pull in their war machines, right? That you and your gun just can't take out. And that's just the sad shame of it, you know? By sponsoring all these rituals, shrines, temples, and festivals, the elites of each city embodied and consolidated their own positions at the top of the Roman imperial order. They not only serve as the imperial priests in their respective cities, but also occupied prominent positions at the apex of pyramids of political economic patronage, all headed by the emperor as the greatest patron of all. The local elites, thus, on the one hand, expressed their generosity in ways beneficial to the people, many of whom ate meat only at such festivals, and on the other, were able to recapitulate the local political economic hierarchy in the rituals, feasting, and public ceremonies. The wealth of the elites, of course, was almost certainly derived from their dominant roles in reproducing the very social relations that their sponsorship of the festivals served to veil. These imperialist priests thus became the mediators between the divine and the human as the very sponsors of the images and rituals that held the whole imperial order together. Religion and political economic structure were thus inseparable in the relations of power, articulated and constituted by imperial images and rituals. The rapid emergence of emperor worship within traditional Greek religion and its spread throughout the empire are suggestive of a theory of religion. While some people who are less civilized by empire resist, other people who are more civilized serve. That's nothing but a word right there. Right? Let's read that again. Right? The rapid emergence of emperor worship within traditional Greek religion and its spread throughout the empire are suggestive of a theory of religion. While some people who are less quote-unquote civilized by empire resist, other people who are more quote-unquote civilized serve or honor and appease as gods, the powers that impinge on and determine their lives. In the Roman imperial order, the most important such power was the emperor, the symbolic as well as quote-unquote real figure at the apex of imperial power relations. You know, as I was reading this last section here, you know, I think about like in the Caribbean, right? When a lot of Caribbean countries got independence, they became what's known as Commonwealth countries, right? Still attached to the colonizer, Britain. And, you know, and I think if KW-7 is still around, isn't the Queen still on like some Canadian money? Like the Queen is still on some certain Caribbean nations as like currency. What does that do? Again, we like to talk about African-centered education and nation building. What does that do to the psyche of a people to see this foreigner on their money? Like to pull out some bills from your pocket and here's Queen Elizabeth's old ugly ass on your money. What does that do to a people's mind? Well, we knew it already, but this paper kind of shows you it's all a part of the imperialist push, right? When you pull that money out your pocket and there's this oppressor, former and possibly even current oppressor on the money, right? You're still beaten. Imagine demanding independence and still allow these folks to be on your money. Are you independent? This brings us to a section called Christmas, the principal festival of consumer capitalism. Before I read it, let me just do a quick station ID break. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure also check out the Queen's Council podcast also on KWAZ Radio. I don't usually bring it up, but I'm going to bring it up for a second time during this episode. Make sure, if you can, donate to the podcast. Cash App, $, Bitter Meds, BITTERMEDZ. All proceeds will be used to improve upon the podcast. The drive right now is to get the podcast back on all your favorite podcast apps. Castbox, Apple, Google, blah, 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 just to get them back all out there, right? So we'll take the time to convert these live episodes to audio episodes for your podcast listening. Where was I? Yes. So we're on Christmas, the principal festival of consumer capitalism. The recent recognition of the importance of the emperor cult in constituting power relations in the Roman Empire may alert us to a corresponding imperial religion in our own quote-unquote New World Order. To recapitulate key aspects of the Roman imperial religion, the economic movers and shakers of the empire, transforming earlier civil religious festivals, developed elaborate festivals celebrating the end and beginning of year and the climax of the annual economic cycle. Public space itself was transformed, pervaded by imperial presence in shrines, statues, and the facades of city centers. The imperial festivals were celebrations of abundance, with indulgence in feasting, drinking, and gift-giving, with the most prominent economic and religious figures of the city presiding over the ceremonies as they displayed their largesse. Their largesse in sponsoring a surfeit of public entertainments that brought a sense of unity to cities and the imperial order. We can find striking analogies to all of these features in the festival of historically unprecedented proportions developed in the United States and now being exported throughout the world. Christmas. Christmas is often understood as a Christian festival. Historically, however, the congregational churches in New England banned the celebration of Christmas as mere indulgence and carousing. American social historians have begun to explain how, with little input from Christianity, Christmas developed as the principal festival of consumer capitalism. American Christmas built on and transformed the old European folk festivals that combine an indulgence in abundance after the harvest with a celebration of light at the winter solstice to ward off anxiety about the renewal of life. The New York Knickerbocker elite transformed the old custom of wassailing into a domestic festival of gift-giving to their children in the privacy of their own houses. Mass production of goods gradually escalated into an orgia, which is ritual in Greek, of gift-giving and consumption. The commercial icon of Santa Claus mystified the relations of mass production with the pretense that gifts were handcrafted and freely bestowed by the jovial, avuncular embodiment of free grace. The Christmas tree, borrowed from German burghers, was transformed into the domestic shrine for the celebration of abundance and gift-giving that expressed love and affection among family and friends, thereby further mystifying the burgeoning orgy of consumption. From the outset of its development, Certain consumer capitalist Christmas, from the outset of its development, therefore, consumer capitalist Christmas was grounded in and articulated the very cycle of nature and the economic production, as well as domestic affection focused on children. With the complete transformation from family farms into industrialization and urbanization, finally into service industries and retailing, the American economy has become all the more dependent on and articulated with the climax of the annual festival of marketing and consumption in the holy days. That now extended from the biggest shopping day of the year, on the day after Thanksgiving, to the quote-unquote after Christmas sales and New Year's Day. Moreover, insofar as the holidays provide an all-important spike in the retailing that dominates the now globalized economy centered in the United States, where Americans consume a great majority of the world's resources, quite apart from human needs, the historically unprecedented festival of Christmas has become a central expression and embodiment of American imperial domination. American consumer capitalists, Christmas has become far more pervasive in public life than the most elaborate ancient Roman emperor cult. Christmas decorations, light exhibits, and advertising pervade public space, particularly in downtown areas, malls, public buildings, and civic plazas. But Christmas pervades not simply public space, it pervades the overall life environment. It appeals to all senses, including the olfactory. Indeed, Christmas even invades private space, and in a most constraining way. It invades our psyches, particularly through advertising, and exploits every available media of music and image, as well as words. And we do not have the freedom not to participate. And we do not have the freedom not to participate. And we do not have the freedom not to participate. All right. In the chat room, I see we got Coach Pete saying good evening. Good evening, Coach Pete. KW Don 7 says the Queen is still the head of state of 15 countries outside of the UK. He goes on to say Barbados was looking to become a republic. Yeah, that came out a couple weeks ago, right? Barbados was looking to become a republic. Right. American Christmas has also co-opted and incorporated American civil religion. As retailing for gift giving escalated from a few days to a few weeks to a whole holiday season, Thanksgiving, the most important holy day in American civil religion. American civil religion, Thanksgiving? Okay. When families celebrate the foundational legend of the nation with a festive meal, became also the beginning of the prolonged holiday festival. Mayors now preside at ceremonial lightings of city Christmas trees, celebrating at the local level, but the president presides over the lighting of the national Christmas tree in front of the White House, residence of the quote-unquote first family. City and town parades like the nationally televised Macy's Parade and Christmas displays that often combine Santa's village, reindeer, snowmen, and nativity scenes further integrate the civil with the commercial dimension. That Christmas is the dominant religious festival in American society is obscured by the ostensible separation of religion and politics and economics, as well as the accompanying distinction between religious/sacred and secular. The Christmas festival has become so effective as an imperial religion precisely because it is understood as secular, as Kathleen Sands has argued convincingly. As a set of secular rituals, Christmas hides from view its own religious functions, so that the ambience and authority of religion can be surreptitiously transferred to commerce and consumption. Only as secular, with its religious character and functions veiled, can Christmas become socially compulsory. Freedom to choose one's religion, including the freedom to participate or not, in religious rituals and holy days is one of America's most cherished rights. Yet we cannot refuse to participate in Christmas rituals of gift giving and other festivities without being socially ostracized. What makes the extended festival for the holidays so overwhelmingly effective is precisely the illusion that Christmas, unlike religion, is informal rather than formal, spontaneous rather than forced, based on our heart's desires rather than on social constraint or obedience. Not coincidentally, these are the very features that legitimate our political economy, which presents itself as an outgrowth of voluntary choices, natural or spontaneous desires, individual initiative, and impartial, non-arbitrary processes. Only insofar as it is understood as secular rather than religious is Christmas able to hide the political, economic forces that it simultaneously legitimates and constitutes. In a puzzling but significant example of doublespeak, both the majority and the minority opinion in the 1984 Supreme Court case discussed the inclusion of a nativity scene in a city's Christmas display of Santa's village and so on as an ostensibly religiously neutral secular space that nevertheless deploys religious symbols in the service of the national identity associated with the thriving of consumer capitalism. Although structural functional analysis has been appropriately out of favor in the last generation because of its inability to come to grips with conflict and contradiction, it may illuminate the functions of Christmas in the complex political, economic, religious system for which it was designed. Among the interrelated functions that religion has served in many societies are the cultivation of personal and group identity, the establishment of community, and the articulation of an overall meaning of life. Given the reduction of functions and the social marginalization of churches, synagogues, and other religious organizations, it should not be surprising that Christmas has filled the vacuum in significant ways. Here we go. The Festival of Lights, gift giving, and the many special rituals, including TV programs in which families participate during the holidays, from Thanksgiving to New Year's Day, may be the key articulations of a sense of family for children. At all stages in personal life, festive family meals and gift exchanges during the holidays secure family identity, as well as family solidarity. Indeed, one's receipt of gifts at Christmas may be a principal articulation of individual identity insofar as commodities have become the generally accepted expression and measure even of personal value, including being valued by one's parents and loved ones in modern capitalistic society. Participation, now quite involuntary, in the prolonged holiday festival also serves to integrate most Americans into the dominant American culture and identity, while still allowing them freedom to follow their ethnic and other religious customs, for example, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, ethnic foods. That's a funny list he put there. Throughout the holiday festival, in performances, ceremonies, watching TV, or shopping in busy malls and stores, people have the sense of belonging and participating in a society-wide festival. Do you guys, I know most of you here won't be celebrating Christmas, right? At least I suspect you won't be. But back when you did celebrate, did Christmas ever really make you feel, especially you guys in the States, did Christmas ever really make you feel part of, like, this big, part of this society, like a family or something like that? Moreover, in so much as the holidays have become the form in which the legendary founding of the society, the ending and renewal of the natural cycle, and the climax of the economic cycle are expressed and observed, this now complex festival articulates a general structure of personal and societal life. The performances of deeply embedded culture texts in various media during the holidays, such as A Christmas Carol, The Nutcracker, and Christmas Caroling, articulate the meaning of Christmas. Many of these performances significantly also serve to sell commodities and consume resources insofar as advertisers sponsor the screening of Hollywood's new Christmas movies. Okay, we get it, guy. Like, all the stuff they do for Christmas, right, is the thinly veiled way of getting most people, right, to participate in their capitalism. We get it. Do we need to see and read about It's a Wonderful Life and all this old shit? Like, we get it. It has been suggested recently that capitalism itself, or the capitalist market, is a religion. That would be an oxymoron so long as religion is understood as sui generis, or in the reductionist sense, dominant in Western society and academia. It makes sense to discuss capitalism as religious, or having a religious dimension, only insofar as religion is understood as integrally related to, perhaps inseparable from, political economy, such as in the holidays. Right? Particularly as capitalism in its ineluctable drive is to grow, has begun to cannibalize previously separate institutions of the public sector. It has increasingly developed features that we would identify as religious. Our task, therefore, is to analyze and understand the religious functions and aspects of the consumer capitalist system. How do the religious aspects of the global empire of consumer capitalism, such as Christmas, work in constituting contemporary relations of power? In a highly influential theory, Clifford Geertz defined religion as, quote, a system of symbols which act to establish powerful, pervasive, long-lasting moods and motivations by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence, end of quote. As Assad points out, with a nod to Marx, however, religion in this reductionist modern Western understanding is external to the relations of production, producing no knowledge, but expressing at once the anguish of the oppressed and a spurious consolation. What do you guys think of that quote? Right? In the consumer capitalist empire, where churches and synagogues and religious belief are so marginalized, the dominant institutions that produce the symbols, or rather images that create, quote, powerful and long-lasting moods and motivations, end of quote, are the mass media owned and used by huge transnational corporations, far more pervasively and effectively than family and church, synagogue, or mosque. The closely interrelated advertising and programming in the media generate powerful images that supply individual and collective identity as they produce people as individual effects of power. The problem I have with that statement, number one, church and synagogue are a part of the media now. Church and synagogue is a part of the media now, right? And also, when you say that it's the media that's the most powerful, or that creates the most powerful and long-lasting moods and motivations, by saying that, a lot of folks would be thrown off and think, oh, no, it's not church, because as he said, he used the term churches have been marginalized. But actually, churches are quite a part of the whole capitalistic system, right? You could scapegoat media, but a church, like I said, is a part of media as well, right? How does Creflo Dollar and them really make all that money? How does Joel Osteen and them really make all that money? Right? It's not just that they're in a church, but they are tapped into the media as well. Right? KW Don 7 says, Xmas is a celebration of Urugu, like all European holidays. Absolutely. Absolutely. In comparison with the religious forms of previous societies, however, media advertising is atomizing people rather than generating community and is bombarding us with images that obviate the possibility of coherent meaning rather than formulating conceptions of a general order of existence. The capitalist market is also increasingly taken over as the dominant source, as well as measure of value and values, far beyond anything Marx saw in the fetishism of commodities. Advertising has transformed commodities into objects significant not because of their intrinsic material, utilitarian, or aesthetic qualities, but rather for their expressive power. Working mainly through images and associations, advertising invests commodities with power to relative anxieties, gratify fantasies, carry meaning, express feelings, and confirm moral and spiritual value, all previously the function of art, poetry, and particularly religion. But it hasn't stopped. Why is my phone buzzing so much? It hasn't stopped being the case, right? That the function of religion is this, right? It just hasn't stopped. By emphasizing the non-material properties of commodities and associating them with the psychological and emotional needs and desires of consumers, modern marketing has mystified consumption in a far more fundamental way than Santa Claus ever did. In consumer capitalism, one gains salvation in the acquisition of certain products. As a means of quote-unquote growing capital, advertising has relentlessly taken over as the primary producer of non-identity and non-meaning and the non-system of images that establish powerful and long-lasting moods and motivations. Advertising manipulates desire in the capitalist system driven no longer by Weber's, or I should say Weber's, Weber's inner worldly asceticism, but rather by inner worldly satisfaction. But like the illusory happiness that Marx saw in 19th century otherworldly Christian piety, the ad-generated desire for commodities is really focused on illusory images that possession of the material commodities cannot satisfy. Okay, we get it, right? We get it. The holidays, of course, produce a gigantic spike in retailing as the climax of the consumer capitalist economic cycle. Much more important is the mystification of commodities as gifts that ostensibly express the purchaser's love and appreciation of friends and family. The virtual transubstantiation of commodities into spiritual, salvific, and morally redeeming objects to be acquired for purposes that transcend the utilitarian and mundane. All right, we get it. Principal factor that blocked New Testament scholars from recognizing that the emperor cult, in the absence of an administrative bureaucracy and an occupying army, virtually constituted power relations in the Roman Empire, was the Christian determined modern understanding of religion as a personal belief. The modern religious fetish of religion as belief similarly prevents recognition of the consumer capitalist holidays as the imperial religion that constitute power relations today. Belief, however, is as irrelevant to Christmas as it was to the Roman imperial cult. Several features of Christmas, of course, require a certain suspension of disbelief. Yet despite pervasive disbelief, for example in Santa Claus or in ads, the symbols and images of Christmas are highly effective in achieving the desired result: the massive purchasing of unneeded commodities for the orgy of gift giving and consumption. What does belief matter when the presence of the power in spirit and image is so pervasive that consumption is simply unavoidable? One participates like everyone else, with no real choice or faith response involved. In the Roman imperial celebrations of Caesar as Lord and Savior, of course, fides pistis meant loyalty to not faith in the emperor and empire. That's an interesting. I kind of like how you put that there. You know, a lot of folks who call themselves religious are really loyal to European doctrine, right? Not really having faith in it, just loyal to it. Like a part of the discussions that went down today on social media that I observed, a lot of folks in the conscious circle, I guess I could say, the Pan-Africanist circle, a lot of folks today were talking about something along these same lines, right? That in the abundance of information, some of your family members, your friends, right, they just won't give up this European indoctrination. And the real reality is that they just have it's not about faith. Because faith will understand information. Faith will move the way that information moves. These folks just have this undying loyalty to something that doesn't benefit, right? And what may be the most important aspect of all the contemporary imperial religion of Christmas differs dramatically from Roman imperial religion. A lot of focus directly and explicitly on the emperor, whom people honored and served in temples, shrines, games, and holidays as a new superhuman force or god that determined their lives. In this regard, the subjects of the ancient Roman imperial order were similar to the people of other ancient empires, such as ancient Babylon, where the political, economic structure and religion were closely interrelated or inseparable. There, the people served the principal forces that determined their lives, such as storm, kingship, and irrigation, wisdom, with their corvée and the produce of their agricultural labor. In contemporary consumer capitalism, however, the determinative power ultimately being served is veiled in mystification, largely kept from entering consciousness. Most vividly in the Christmas festival itself, the cultivation of the Christmas spirit in ceremonies, lights, music, and displays, along with advertising's endowment of commodities with spiritual powers and effects, effectively diverts attention from the power that is being served in the purchase of these commodities. It is imprecise at best to talk as if the market is God. The market is the economic system through which capital generates profit or growth. But the force that determines life is capital. The religious features and festivals of consumer capitalism then serve to veil and obscure that in both the market and its religious expressions, we are ultimately serving the superhuman and supernatural force that determines our lives, global capital. This brings us to, I believe, our last section, religion as effect of and response to imperial power. It would appear that as often as not, religion and other forms of cultural practice are embedded in political economic power relations and far from being reducible to them, reflect, express, resist, and even constitute those relations of power. The way in which religious expressions form and develop depends on the particular configuration of imperial power relations, as illustrated variously in the three general patterns evident in historical and modern cases examined above. In both Western constructed Buddhism and the Roman aristocratic devotion to Isis, an imperial elite adapted a subject people's religion for its own spiritual transcendence of an unsatisfying life at the center of the imperial metropolis. In both the recent Iranian Revolution and the ancient Judean movements and revolts, subjected peoples pursued renewal of their own traditional ways of life in resistance to threatened disintegration by imperial power. And in both the Roman Emperor cult and the American consumer capitalist Christmas, the dominant aristocratic or corporate pyramids of political economic power constructed an imperial religion that virtually constituted imperial power relations, making political and military power superfluous to the imperial system in already civilized areas. It is simply impossible to approach or understand any of these cases as apart from the historical configuration of imperial power that they were attempting respectively to transcend, resist, or constitute and reinforce. In each of these cases of religion and empire, religion appears to have been inseparable from an even. Sorry, let me read that again. In each of these cases of religion and empire, religion appears to have been inseparable from and even the product of particular imperial relations. These investigations of the relations between religion and imperialism suggest that we have a good deal of critical conceptual work to do in the study of religion. It might be tempting in our current deconstructionist drive to conclude that religion is indeed simply the product of our scholarly guilds. The modern Iranian and ancient Judean cases explored above suggest that religion cannot be dismissed in a quote-unquote vulgar materialist way, as reducible to political and economic factors, much as the latter operate as generative factors in such religiously motivated generation of social and political power. Nor can the problems in our interrelated fields of study be addressed by working out a more satisfactory definition of religion. The quest for a definition of religion as something in itself may simply stand in the way of recognizing the various ways in which what may appear as religious expressions are inseparably related to other aspects of life. The various meanings and practices that we refer to as religious are always already in a context of political, economic, and other relationships. I think that's an important line right there. At least for the foreseeable future. As we strive for critical studies of religion, we must almost certainly be thinking in terms of religion and the relation of the religious and the secular, for example, cries out for critical examination. As illustrated currently by the Christian right in the United States and Islamic revival movements in the Middle East, Western secularism, with its pretensions to universalism, has been exposed as value-laden and contestable. Even certain historians and social scientists have recognized that secular nationalism carries many of the key functions previously understood as religious, precisely as it marginalizes and displaces religious institutions that previously carried those functions. The relentless expansion of the American holidays in the United States into a religious festival of historically unprecedented proportions illustrates how, in its secular pretensions, capitalism has begun to collapse the previously institutionalized separate spheres of religion and society into a monolithic imperial system. Do you guys agree with that statement? Do you agree that capitalism has begun to collapse what people used to refer to as the private sphere, right? Or the sphere of religion and the sphere of society? Like, do you think that it's like capitalism has made us just this monolithic society? I don't know about that. I'm not sure about that at all. Most important, surely, given the establishment of religious and biblical studies as components of the Western imperial metropolis, with its deeply ingrained understanding of religion as individual and marginalized, is their inability to comprehend the relation of religion and power. If, on the other hand, religious and biblical studies were to recognize how religious practices are embodied in imperial power relations, then they might well play a role in the new world order dominated by global capitalism. Recognition of the role of power in the modern Western marginalization of religion, for example, enables students of religion to discern how construction and cultivation of religion primarily as individualistic spirituality, identity, and meaning tends to leave the operations of political economic power uncontested and acquiesces in the commodification of religious expression. Okay, we get it. All right. Recognition finally that imperial power can generate and work effectively through its own religious practices can enable students of religion to develop a criticism of imperial power and its effects. In biblical studies, we are now becoming aware that in the cities of the Apostle Paul's mission, the civic and economic elite developed out of traditional religious materials an elaborate set of temples, shrines, games, and annual festivals in which they rendered divine honors and faithful service to the imperial power that have come to determine their lives. Such historical cases can inform a contemporary criticism of the religious pretensions and effects of the power that now determines people's lives. Ironically, the very secularism that supposedly protects cultural and religious pluralism serves as a veil for religious functions of consumer capitalism and its Christmas festival. Just as it corrupted and collapsed pagan, Christian, and Jewish religious observances and the public space of civil society into the dominant capitalist order, so global capitalism is now co-opting and eliminating cultural pluralism, even as it produces cultural diversity in commodity form. This power relentlessly eliminates not only natural species in its hunger for material resources, but also languages and peoples in its transcendent pretensions to universal control. The neo-imperialism of global capitalism leaves religious studies with new manifestations of religion and power to discern and delineate. It also places in an awkward difficulty of defining our role. We could settle for serving mainly as curators of religious texts and rituals, as artifacts left in the wake of imperial power. But we also have something to say to power on behalf of cultural and religious pluralism on the basis of the heritage of the very religious expressions and practices we study. But we also have something to say to power on behalf of cultural and religious pluralism on the basis of the heritage of the very religious expressions and practices we study. So this paper was just okay. It doesn't address the African situation. We addressed that in the chat room. I think we addressed it sufficiently well. But right now, in this time and in this place, there needs to be a similar pushback, a similar renaissance, if you will, of Africans supporting and practicing African spirituality. If you know that what these folks are doing to and around you, right, then you must know that you need to push back against it and dig deeper and go deeper in your history, particularly in your spiritual history, and bring back the former spiritual awareness that we had, right? It's clear that what we're practicing today is a form of imperialism. It's them pushing their ideals and their nonsense on us. And more importantly, it's them stopping us from pursuing, it seems, our own ideals, our own thoughts, our own expression. And that's something we got to stop. All right. To those of you who were here live with me today, I appreciate all of you. In the chat room, shout out KW Don 7. Coach Pete was here. The Pro Black Perspective was here, giving me good insights and good dialogue during the paper. Thabo was here. Peace to Thabo. And that's it. Some of our regulars weren't here tonight, but that's fine. You know, I don't expect you to be here every night, but if you missed out on the show and you're listening to the playback, the live show, and you're listening to the playback, post your questions and comments in the comment section. I really do love to answer those type of questions when they do come up in the comment section, so it's always a joy to do that. It's always a joy to talk to you guys in the chat room, of course, but it's also a joy to see that even after I've done the show and it's posted, someone comes along, takes a listen, and has serious questions or serious comments to make, and we can have a dialogue in the comment section. I will be back on Thursday. Thursday, we'll make sure to have a nice upbeat paper or discussion. And then Saturday, I'm going to do the Shooting the Breeze segment on Saturday. I think the first one went well. We'll repeat it on Saturday. You guys come through with your topics, come through with your knowledge, teach me something, put me on to some story I didn't know. And let's share that information with everyone who comes across the episode, who views it, you know? Until next time, though, guys, I'm going to head out now. Until next time, this has been Koku with the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.